You're too poor to marry my son. Patricia's voice cut through the low murmur of Marcella's dining room, loud enough that the couple at the next table looked up from their pasta. I sat frozen across from her, Michael pale beside me, as his mother dabbed her mouth with the linen napkin like she'd just commented on the weather. Our server, Emma, hovered nearby with the wine bottle, her eyes darting between us like she'd walked into a crime scene. Patricia continued, something about my background, my prospects, how I'd hold Michael back. I barely heard it. My hands were steady on the table, but my mind was screaming because Patricia didn't know something. Something that was about to change everything. And honestly, I couldn't wait to watch it all unfold. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. 2 years before that nightmare dinner, I met Michael at a community fundraiser for a youth mentorship program. I'd donated the catering, something I did quarterly for local nonprofits, and stayed to help serve. He was there volunteering, sleeves rolled up, talking to a group of teenagers about college applications like their futures actually mattered to him. We got to talking during cleanup, and I was struck by how genuine he seemed. No pretense, no agenda, just this quiet kindness that felt rare. He told me he was a social worker working with at-risk youth, and his eyes lit up when he described helping a kid get their first job. I found it incredibly attractive. When he asked what I did, I kept it vague, said I worked in hospitality management. Not technically a lie, but not the whole truth either. See, I'd learned my lesson about leading with money. My last relationship had imploded when my ex realized I had wealth, and suddenly I wasn't a girlfriend anymore. I was a retirement plan. Before that, I dated someone who resented my success, made snide comments about me, probably thinking I was better than everyone. So I decided, next time, I'd let someone get to know me first. Just me, not my bank account, not my business. Just the person I was at my core. Michael never pushed for details. He didn't care that I drove a 7-year-old Honda or that our dates were coffee shops and hiking trails. He liked me for me, or so I thought. We fell into an easy rhythm. Trivia nights, volunteering together, cooking dinner at his place. It felt healthy, balanced, real. I told myself I'd tell him about Marcella's eventually, when the time was right, when I knew for sure he loved me and not what I could offer him. I thought I was being smart, protecting myself. I didn't realize I was also hiding the very thing that would later become a weapon in someone else's hands. Our first year together was the kind of relationship I'd always wanted, but never quite believed existed. We'd meet for coffee before work, him heading to the community center in his rumpled button-downs, me to the restaurant, still keeping things vague. Weekends meant hiking trails outside the city, where Michael would point out birds he'd learned to identify as a kid, or lazy Sunday mornings, where we'd binge cooking shows and argue about whether the contestants were being judged fairly. He never once asked about my salary. Never suggested expensive restaurants or weekend getaways I'd have to explain I could easily afford. Money just wasn't part of our vocabulary. And I loved that about us. We'd talk instead about the things that actually mattered. How to make the world slightly less terrible, whether we wanted kids someday, our shared frustration with people who didn't return their shopping carts. Stupid, normal, beautiful stuff. Around month 8, Michael started mentioning his mother more frequently. They talked on the phone every Sunday. He'd visit her for dinner once a month, and he described her as his best friend growing up after his father passed when he was 12. Sweet, right? Except every time I'd suggest meeting her, he'd get this look. Not quite panic, but close. He'd say things like, soon, or I want to wait until we're really serious, or my personal favorite. She can be particular about these things. I'd laugh it off, tease him about being a mama's boy, but there was something in his tone that felt off. Like he wasn't protecting me from her judgment, he was protecting her from having to make it too soon. I told myself I was reading too much into it. Every family had quirks, right? Every mother was probably a little territorial about her son. It was normal, fine, totally fine, except it wasn't fine, and some part of me already knew it. I just didn't want to admit that the man I was falling in love with might come with strings attached that I couldn't untangle, no matter how genuine his feelings for me were. At 10 months, Michael finally arranged the meeting. Patricia chose the location, an olive garden off the highway, which should have been my first clue about what she thought of me. She was waiting when we arrived, already seated, wearing pearls and an expression that could have curdled milk. The hug she gave Michael was warm, genuine, full of maternal affection. The handshake she offered me was limp and cold, like touching a fish at the supermarket. Within 5 minutes, she'd launched into what I can only describe as an interrogation disguised as polite conversation. Where was I from? A small town upstate, nothing special. What did my parents do? Dad was a mechanic, Mom worked retail. Where did I go to school? Community college. Then I worked full-time, so it took me 6 years to finish my business degree. With each answer, her smile got thinner, more forced, like she was watching her worst fears confirmed in real time. She asked what I did for work, and I gave my standard line about working in restaurant management, working my way up from hostess. She actually said, "Oh, how industrious," in a tone that made industrious sound like an insult. She wanted to know about my 5-year plan, my career trajectory, whether I had substantial savings or investments. Michael shifted uncomfortably beside me, cutting his fettuccine into smaller and smaller pieces. But he didn't say a word. Not when she asked if I had student loans. I didn't because I'd paid them off, but I could tell the fact that I'd had them at all was a mark against me. Not when she mentioned that Michael's ex-girlfriend Madison had gone to Dartmouth. Not when she looked at my car in the parking lot afterward and made a comment about how practical it was. I spent the drive home telling Michael it was fine, that first meetings were always awkward, that she just needed time to warm up to me. He seemed relieved that I wasn't upset, squeezed my hand, promised she'd come around. But here's the thing, I wasn't fine. I was already making excuses for her, already trying to win over someone who decided I wasn't worth knowing before I'd even sat down. And Michael had let it happen, had sat there pushing pasta around his plate while his mother made me feel like I should apologize for existing. I told myself it was nerves, that he didn't want to make the first meeting worse by creating conflict. I told myself a lot of things that day. None of them were true. Over the next 6 months, Patricia's disapproval became a regular feature of my life, like a subscription service I never signed up for but couldn't seem to cancel. Michael's birthday dinner? She forgot to tell me about it until the day of, then acted surprised I hadn't known. Thanksgiving? Oh, I thought Michael mentioned it was just immediate family this year, as if I were some casual acquaintance and not the person who'd been sleeping in her son's bed for over a year. When I was included, I almost wished I hadn't been. Christmas meant listening to Patricia reminisce about the time Madison's family invited them to the Hamptons, how sophisticated and cultured Madison was, how she knew which fork to use. Easter brought commentary on my quaint apartment when she dropped by unannounced. Never mind that it was a renovated loft in a great neighborhood that I actually owned, but she didn't need to know that. She made a hobby of mentioning my Honda, asking if I'd thought about upgrading or if I needed help with a down payment. Every comment was wrapped in concern, delivered with a smile that never reached her eyes, designed to remind me that I wasn't good enough and never would be. And me? I smiled through it all, laughed at her jokes that weren't really jokes, changed the subject when she brought up Madison for the 14th time, helped with dishes while she told Michael, loud enough for me to hear, that she worried he was settling because he was too kind for his own good. I told myself I was being mature, that I was taking the high road, that pushing back would only make things worse for Michael. Really, I was doing what I'd always done, making myself smaller, quieter, less inconvenient, hoping that if I just tried hard enough, if I just proved myself worthy enough, she'd finally accept me. Spoiler alert, people like Patricia don't accept you. They just get bolder when they realize you won't fight back. The family dynamics became clearer when I finally met Michael's younger brother Trevor at a family barbecue that summer. Trevor arrived in a sleek black BMW, a gift from Patricia to help him establish himself professionally, wearing a suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage. He worked in finance, something vague with hedge funds that he explained in a way designed to make you feel stupid for asking. Patricia's face literally glowed when she looked at him. It was like watching someone transform from a disapproving judge into a proud peacock, preening over her favorite child. She hung on his every word, laughed at his mediocre jokes, insisted on showing me his college photos. Trevor graduated summa cum laude from Cornell, like I'd asked for his resume. His girlfriend, Amber, was apparently in her second year at Columbia Law, and Patricia mentioned this approximately 12 times in 4 hours. Amber is so driven, so ambitious. Trevor would never date someone without goals, she said, looking directly at me as I flipped burgers on the grill. The comparison was constant and exhausting. Trevor's new promotion, Trevor's investment portfolio, Trevor's sophisticated taste in wine. When Michael mentioned helping secure funding for a new after-school program, Patricia patted his hand and said, "That's nice, dear, but Trevor just closed a deal worth 7 figures," like they were competing in the same sport, and Michael kept showing up to the wrong stadium. The worst part? Trevor wasn't even particularly terrible to me. He was polite in that distant, disinterested way that made it clear he'd assessed my worth in 30 seconds and found it lacking, but he didn't go out of his way to be cruel. He didn't have to. Patricia did all the heavy lifting, making sure I understood the hierarchy. Trevor at the top, Michael in the middle, as long as he made acceptable choices, and me at the bottom, dragging her precious son down with my ordinary, working-class existence. I started to feel it in my chest, this constant weight of inadequacy, like I was walking around with a sign that said, "Not good enough," and everyone could see it but me. I'd go home after these family events and feel exhausted, hollowed out, like I'd spent hours defending myself in a trial where I wasn't allowed to speak. Michael would ask if I had a good time, and I'd lie and say yes, because what was the alternative? Admitting that his mother's love came with conditions I'd never meet? That I was starting to resent him for not seeing it, or worse, for seeing it and not caring enough to stop it. I tried talking to Michael about it after Trevor's birthday party, where Patricia had spent 20 minutes explaining why Amber would make such an elegant bride, while staring pointedly at me. Michael listened, nodding along, and then said the words that should have been my exit cue. "That's just how she is." He explained that his mother was protective, that she'd been hurt when things didn't work out with Madison, that she needed time to see how serious we were. "She means well," he insisted, which is what people always say about difficult people when they don't want to deal with the difficulty. I pointed out the constant comparisons, the forgotten invitations, the thinly veiled insults about my background. He sighed like I was being exhausting and said, "She wants the best for me. Can you really blame a mother for that?" Which was a neat trick, making me the unreasonable one for objecting to being treated like garbage. When I pushed harder, his eyes got red and his voice cracked, and suddenly I was comforting him about how stressful it was being caught in the middle, how much pressure he felt trying to make everyone happy. The fight ended with me apologizing for bringing it up, promising I'd try harder to win his mother over, assuring him I understood she just needed more time. I'd done it again, prioritized someone else's comfort over my own dignity. It was a pattern I knew well, one I'd promised myself I'd break, and yet here I was, falling right back into it. The peacekeeper, the accommodating one, the person who swallowed their hurt so everyone else could feel better. I told myself it would be worth it, that once Patricia saw how committed I was, how much I loved her son, she'd finally accept me. I'd prove I was good enough by sheer force of patience and grace. Looking back, I want to shake that version of myself and ask what the hell I thought I was proving and to who. because Patricia didn't want me to prove anything. She wanted me gone. And Michael? He wanted me to stop making him choose, which meant he'd already chosen, just not the way I'd hoped. At 18 months, Michael proposed. It was a perfect moment. A picnic at the park where we'd had our first real date. Sunset, turning the sky orange and pink. A simple ring he'd clearly saved for. He gave this nervous, rambling speech about how I made him want to be better, how he'd never felt this way about anyone, how he wanted to build a life together. I said yes before he'd even finished talking, and for about 10 beautiful minutes I felt like the luckiest person alive. Then he said, "I want to tell my mom tomorrow. Just me, I think. You know how she is. I want to prepare her the right way." And there it was, the cold trickle of reality. I had to be announced like bad news, managed like a PR crisis. But I smiled and said, of course, that made sense, whatever he needed. He went to Patricia's house the next day for Sunday dinner while I waited at his apartment, scrolling through wedding Pinterest boards and trying not to think about why my engagement needed a strategic communication plan. When he came back 3 hours later, he looked like he'd aged a decade. His mother had concerns, serious concerns, about our financial future, about whether I could contribute equally to a marriage, about whether we were rushing into things. She thought we should wait, maybe a year or two, until we were more established. Translation: until I magically became someone else, someone worthy of her son. Michael sat on the couch with his head in his hands and said we'd work through it, that she'd come around once she saw how committed we were, that she just needed time to adjust. All his greatest hits. I heard myself saying supportive things, understanding things, telling him it was okay. We didn't need to rush. We had our whole lives ahead of us. But something had cracked open inside me, and I couldn't close it back up. I looked at this man I loved, this good man who worked with at-risk kids and cried at animal shelter commercials, and I realized he was never going to stand up for me. Not really. He'd comfort me after his mother hurt me. He'd acknowledge her behavior was difficult. He'd promise it would get better, but he'd never actually stop it from happening. I was signing up for a lifetime of this. Family dinners where Patricia made comments about my unsuitability. Holidays where I'd be tolerated at best. Future children being compared unfavorably to Trevor's hypothetical perfect offspring. And Michael in the middle, always in the middle, asking me to understand, to be patient, to give it more time. That night, wearing my new engagement ring, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking, is this what love is supposed to feel like? Like you're constantly auditioning for a role you'll never quite book. I finally broke down and told Allison everything over drinks at her place, ugly crying into a glass of wine while she listened with increasingly horrified expressions. Allison was my best friend from college and my business partner. She handled the financial side of Marcella's while I ran operations. And she knew things about me I'd never told Michael. When I finished explaining the engagement situation, she was quiet for a long moment, then said, "Let me get this straight. You've been hiding the fact that you're successful and financially independent because you didn't want to attract gold diggers. And now you're being treated like a gold digger by some suburban nightmare who thinks you're after her son's social worker salary?" When she put it like that, it sounded insane. She leaned forward, her tone shifting from sympathetic to deadly serious. "Does Michael even know that you own Marcella's?" I admitted he didn't. Not exactly. He knew I worked there, knew I'd been there for 7 years. But I'd let him assume I was management, maybe a general manager at most. I'd never explicitly corrected the assumption. Allison stared at me like I'd grown a second head. "You own one of the most successful restaurants in the city. You have a 2-month waiting list. Food critics write love letters about your menu. You're profiled in magazines. And you've let this man and his awful mother treat you like you're some kind of charity case?" I tried to explain my reasoning, that I wanted Michael to love me for me, that money had ruined past relationships, that I was trying to build something real. Allison cut me off. "Building something real requires honesty. You've been lying by omission for almost 2 years. But here's the real question. Why are you protecting someone who won't stand up for you? That landed like a punch. She wasn't done. You've spent 18 months being insulted, excluded, and compared to some Hampton's princess, and Michael's response has been to ask you to be more patient. You're about to marry into a family where you'll always be the help, the poor girl who trapped their precious boy, and you're doing it while sitting on enough money to buy Patricia's house twice over. For what? To prove you're noble? To test if he really loves you? She grabbed my hands. Sweetie, you've already tested it. He failed. He's shown you exactly who he is. Someone who will choose his comfort over your dignity every single time. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Allison's words stuck with me like a splinter I couldn't ignore, and I started paying attention in a way I hadn't before. Really watching Michael, really listening to what he said, and more importantly, what he didn't say. The next Sunday dinner at Patricia's was illuminating in the worst way. Patricia made one of her usual comments, something about how I must be living paycheck to paycheck in this economy, and how stressful that must be for me. I waited for Michael to say something, anything, to point out that she didn't actually know anything about my finances, or that it was inappropriate to speculate, or even just to change the subject in a way that shut her down. Instead, he just started talking about a new policy at work, smoothly redirecting the conversation while Patricia's assumption hung in the air, unchallenged and therefore confirmed as truth. He did it again when she mentioned my little job at the restaurant. Again when she suggested I should consider going back to school for something more stable. Every single time he'd pivot away rather than correct her, and I realized something that made my stomach turn. Michael wasn't just avoiding conflict. He was allowing his mother to believe a version of me that didn't exist because correcting her would require him to admit he'd never actually asked. Never actually cared enough to know the details of my life beyond what I'd volunteered. Or worse, and this thought kept me up at night, maybe he was embarrassed. Maybe having a girlfriend who worked in restaurants, who came from nothing, who didn't summer in the Hamptons fit into some narrative he had about himself as a good person, who didn't care about superficial things. Maybe I was his proof that he wasn't shallow like Trevor, that he valued real things. But the moment he'd have to defend that choice to his mother, to actually stand up and say, I chose this person, and you will respect her, he folded like a house of cards. I watched him across the dinner table, laughing at his mother's stories, and felt something cold and hard settling in my chest. Not heartbreak, not yet. Anger, quiet, steady, building anger at myself for accepting this, and at him for asking me to. Because whether Michael was embarrassed by me or just too weak to face his mother's disapproval, the result was the same. I was alone in this relationship, fighting battles he pretended not to see. 3 weeks after that Sunday dinner, Patricia called Michael and demanded, not requested, demanded, a family dinner to discuss our future. Michael came home looking like he'd been summoned to the principal's office, explaining that his mother wanted to meet on neutral, upscale ground, where we could have an honest conversation about our engagement and her concerns. The location she'd chosen? Marcella's. I actually laughed out loud, which confused Michael until I covered it by saying I was just nervous. Patricia had selected my restaurant, the business I'd built from nothing, as the backdrop for what was clearly going to be some kind of intervention about my unsuitability for her son. The irony was so perfect, it almost felt scripted. Michael warned me it might be uncomfortable, which was like warning someone a hurricane might be breezy, but he'd already agreed to it. Of course he had. I asked him carefully why his mother had chosen Marcella specifically. He shrugged and said she'd mentioned wanting to go somewhere nice, somewhere that would set the right tone for a serious conversation, and that she'd heard good things about the place. It clicked then, fully and completely. Patricia had no idea I owned Marcella's. Why would she? Michael didn't know, so he'd never told her. In nearly 2 years together, he'd never asked enough questions about my work to learn that the restaurant I managed was actually mine. He'd never wondered why I had such flexible hours, or why the staff greeted me the way they did on the rare occasions he'd pick me up from work, or why I was so invested in every detail of the operations. He'd just accepted the simple version I'd offered and never looked deeper. And now Patricia was going to use my own restaurant as the setting for her grand rejection of me, completely unaware that she was walking into my house to tell me I wasn't good enough to enter hers. I made a decision right then, standing in Michael's kitchen while he apologized preemptively for whatever his mother was about to say. I wasn't going to tell him. I wasn't going to warn Patricia. I was going to let this dinner happen exactly as she'd planned it, and I was going to watch it all unfold. If Michael wouldn't stand up for me, if he couldn't even be bothered to really know me, then maybe it was time everyone saw the truth. All of it. I smiled at Michael and told him it would be fine, that we'd get through it together. But for the first time since I'd met him, I wasn't trying to keep the peace. I was preparing for war. I arrived at Marcella's 2 hours before the reservation, which wasn't unusual. I was there most days anyway, but this time felt different. I found David, my general manager, in the kitchen doing prep checks and pulled him into my office. David had been with me since we opened 7 years ago, had seen me through every crisis and triumph, and when I explained what was about to happen, his face went through a journey of expressions that ended on protective fury. "She's going to do what? Here?" he asked. And I could see him already mentally preparing for battle. I told him I needed the staff to act normal, professional, nothing out of the ordinary, until the moment I decided otherwise. He understood immediately, promised that everyone would be briefed and ready, and added that he'd personally handle our table. "She's not going to know what hit her," he said with a grim smile, and I felt a surge of gratitude for people who actually had my back. I went home to change, standing in my closet for 20 minutes, deciding what to wear. I settled on simple, nice black pants, a silk blouse, minimal jewelry, nothing that screamed money or success. I wanted to look exactly like what Patricia expected, the struggling restaurant manager trying her best to look presentable for an upscale dinner she probably couldn't afford. Let her make her assumptions, let her feel confident in her judgments, let her say everything she'd been thinking for the past 18 months without any filter. I needed Michael to hear it all, needed to see if he'd finally find his spine when his mother dropped the pretense of civility. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me as I drove back to the restaurant. Patricia had chosen Marcella's to intimidate me, to put me in a setting that screamed, "This is the world my son deserves, and you don't belong in it." She'd picked one of the most prestigious restaurants in the city to remind me of my place, not knowing that every table, every dish, every carefully chosen wine on the list was mine. That the reviews praising the innovative farm-to-table approach and impeccable attention to detail were about my vision, my work, my 7 years of 18-hour days and calculated risks. She thought she was bringing me into unfamiliar territory to make me uncomfortable. Really, she was walking into my domain and handing me home field advantage. The quiet bomb was armed. All I had to do was wait for Patricia to light the fuse herself. Patricia arrived exactly on time, which somehow felt aggressive, sweeping into Marcella's like she owned the place. Oh, the irony, in a designer dress and enough pearls to stock a jewelry store. She made a production of greeting the host, commenting on the lovely ambiance and mentioning she'd heard this was the place to be seen. Michael was already tense, his shoulders up around his ears, and I could see him bracing for impact. We were seated at one of the best tables, courtesy of David's subtle maneuvering, and Patricia immediately took control, ordering a bottle of wine that cost $200 without blinking. "I hope you don't mind," she said, looking directly at me. "I know it's expensive, but Michael and I have always appreciated the finer things. We can split it 3 ways if that's easier for you." The implication was clear. I probably couldn't afford my third. I just smiled and said that sounded fine, watching her settle into her performance. She asked about the menu with the kind of exaggerated familiarity that people use when they want everyone to know They're sophisticated, mispronouncing gremolata, while explaining to me what it was. She asked how my job at the restaurant was going, and I gave her the vaguest possible answers. Busy. Going well. You know how it is. Each non-answer seemed to confirm whatever story she'd already decided was true, and I could see her getting bolder, more confident. Michael sat between us like a statue, contributing nothing, his eyes fixed on his water glass like it held the secrets of the universe. After the appetizers arrived, she ordered for the table without asking what we wanted. Patricia dabbed her mouth with her napkin and announced it was time to discuss the elephant in the room. Her tone shifted, became serious, almost kind, which was somehow worse than her usual barely veiled contempt. She started talking about Michael's future, about the kind of life he deserved, the kind of partner who could stand beside him as an equal. "I've been quiet about my concerns," she said, which was laughable, but I think it's time we're all honest about the reality of this situation. Michael is my son, my priority, and I need to know that the person he marries can truly be a partner to him, financially, socially, in every way that matters. 2 glasses of wine in, Patricia leaned back in her chair and delivered her verdict with the confidence of someone who believed she was doing me a favor. "You're too poor to marry my son." She said it clearly, loud enough that the couple at the next table glanced over, and I felt the words land like a slap. But she wasn't done. Oh no, she was just getting started. She explained, in excruciating detail, that I came from nothing, had no real prospects, no family connections, no financial stability beyond my little restaurant job, that I would hold Michael back from the life he deserved, the life he'd been raised for. She talked about my car, my education, my background, like she was presenting evidence in a trial where I'd already been found guilty. "You're a sweet girl," she said, and I wanted to laugh at the condescension dripping from those words. But Michael needs someone who can match him, who can elevate him, someone from his world, not someone he'd have to support and worry about. She suggested we end things now, before we got in any deeper, before there were legal complications, or, God forbid, children. She even offered to help me find someone more suitable. Her words, someone in my own class, who I wouldn't have to struggle to keep up with. The cruelty was breathtaking, delivered with a smile, like she was doing me the kindness of my life. Michael had gone pale, his knuckles white around his fork, but he was frozen, silent, exactly as useless as I'd expected. I stayed calm, my hands steady on the table, and asked her to clarify exactly what she meant. What prospects was she looking for? What financial threshold did I need to meet? Patricia, thinking she'd won, thinking I was just too stupid or stubborn to accept defeat gracefully, became even more explicit. She mentioned numbers, savings accounts, investment portfolios, family assets. She said Madison had come from money, real money, the kind that opened doors and created opportunities. She said Trevor would never date someone so ordinary, and that she'd raised her sons to have standards. "I'm not trying to be cruel," she said, which is what cruel people always say. "I'm trying to protect my son from making a mistake he'll regret for the rest of his life. You have to understand, this isn't personal. You're simply not what this family needs." I let her finish, let every poisonous word hang in the air between us, let the nearby tables absorb every detail of her assessment of my unworthiness. Then I set down my wine glass, slowly, and caught David's eye across the restaurant. He was there in seconds, professional as always, asking if everything was satisfactory with our meal. "David," I said, my voice steady and clear, "I don't think you've been formally introduced to my fiancé's mother. Patricia, this is David Chen, my general manager." Patricia looked confused, glancing between us like she'd missed part of the conversation. "General manager?" she repeated. I smiled. Not warm, not cold, just calm. "Yes, David runs the day-to-day operations here at Marcella's for me. He's been with me since we opened 7 years ago." I watched her process the words, saw the moment they started to click into place, but her brain rejected the conclusion because it couldn't possibly be right. I don't work at Marcella's, Patricia. I own it. I founded it when I was 25 with a business loan I paid back in 3 years. This restaurant, the one you chose to have this conversation in, the one you picked because you thought it would remind me of everything I don't have, it's mine. Every table, every dish, every bottle of wine in that cellar. Mine. Patricia's face went on a journey. Confusion melted into disbelief, then horror as she looked around the restaurant, really looked at it this time, seeing it through new eyes. The expensive decor, the packed tables on a Thursday night, the wait list she'd had to name drop to get around. David stood beside our table, and I saw Patricia notice the way he looked at me, the deference, the familiarity of someone who'd worked alongside me for years. "That's not... You said you worked in restaurant management," she stammered, and I could see her trying to find solid ground in a conversation that had just shifted beneath her feet. "I do," I said simply. "I manage my restaurant." I wasn't lying, Patricia. I just never elaborated, and nobody ever asked. She turned to Michael, desperate now, looking for him to confirm this was some kind of joke, some elaborate setup. But Michael looked as shocked as she did, staring at me like I'd just announced I was actually an alien. He didn't know. After almost 2 years together, he genuinely had no idea. Patricia tried to laugh it off, a nervous, high-pitched sound that didn't match the panic in her eyes. "Well, I was just testing you, seeing if you'd be honest about your success. I've been misunderstood. Clearly, I never meant..." I held up a hand, and she stopped talking. "Let me make sure I understand correctly," I said, my voice calm, almost conversational, though I could feel the cold fury radiating through every word. "For 18 months, you've told me I'm not good enough for your son. You've excluded me from family events, compared me to Michael's ex-girlfriend at every opportunity, and made comments about my car, my apartment, my background, and my job. You've suggested I'm after Michael's money, his social worker salary. You've called me ordinary, unsuitable, and a mistake. You did this at Thanksgiving, at Christmas, at Easter, at Trevor's birthday party, where you spent 20 minutes explaining why his girlfriend would make a better daughter-in-law. And tonight, you brought me here to tell me, explicitly and publicly, that I'm too poor to marry your son." Other diners were watching now, not even pretending to focus on their meals. Patricia's face had gone from red to white. "You suggested I find someone in my own class. You offered to help me understand why I need to break up with Michael for his own good. You did all of this here, at Marcella's, a restaurant with a 2-month waiting list that's been featured in Bon Appetit and The Times, that I built from absolutely nothing." I turned to Michael then, and his expression was somewhere between shock and something that might have been shame. "Did you know I owned this place?" I asked him directly. He shook his head, his voice barely a whisper. "No, I thought you just managed it." "In 2 years you never asked? Never wondered why I had such flexible hours, or why I was so invested, or why the staff treats me the way they do?" He had no answer. "And in those same 2 years, how many times did you hear your mother insult me? How many times did you sit there silent while she made assumptions about my finances, my worth, my place in your life? How many times did you let her talk about me like I was some kind of charity case you'd taken pity on?" My voice was still calm, still controlled, but every word landed like a hammer. "You never corrected her, not once." Michael found his voice then, though I almost wished he hadn't. "I was trying to keep the peace," he said, his words tumbling out desperately. "I thought she'd come around eventually. I thought if I just gave her time. I didn't know it was this bad. I didn't know you felt..." I cut him off. "You were there, Michael. You were there at that first lunch when she interrogated me about my student loans. You were there at Thanksgiving when she forgot to invite me. You were there every single time she compared me to Madison, every time she made a comment about my car or my apartment or my background. You heard every word. You saw my face after every family dinner. You knew." He tried again, reaching for my hand across the table. I was trying to protect you, trying not to make it worse by creating conflict. You were protecting yourself, I said, pulling my hand back. You were choosing your comfort over my dignity. And you know what the worst part is? I let you. I've spent 18 months making myself smaller, quieter, more acceptable, trying to prove I was worthy of a family that had already decided I wasn't. I've done this before, in different ways, with different people. I tolerate mistreatment because I think if I just try hard enough, if I just prove myself enough, eventually I'll be valued. But that's not how it works, is it? I looked at Patricia, then back at Michael. Your mother didn't need to know I own this restaurant to treat me with basic respect. My bank account shouldn't determine whether I deserve kindness. And you should have stood up for me whether I was a restaurant owner or actually did live paycheck to paycheck like your mother assumed. The fact that you didn't, that you never even asked enough questions to know who I really was, tells me everything I need to know about what this relationship actually meant to you. I pulled the engagement ring off my finger. It felt lighter than it should have, like it had never really belonged there anyway, and placed it on the table between us. The small clink of metal on wood seemed impossibly loud in the silence that had fallen over our section of the restaurant. I'm done trying to be good enough for people who've already decided I'm not. I'm done being the peacekeeper in situations where I'm the only one being asked to keep sacrificing pieces of myself. I'm just done. I need you both to leave, I said, and my voice was steady, even though something inside me was trembling. Michael opened his mouth to argue, to plead, to do whatever he thought would fix this, but I shook my head. Now, please. Patricia found her spine then, or what passed for it. Her shock crystallizing into indignation. Absolutely not. We are going to sit here and talk about this like adults. You don't get to embarrass me in public and then dismiss me like... I caught David's eye again, and he was already moving toward us with 2 other staff members. David, please, escort my guests out. Patricia's voice rose, sharp and shrill. You can't throw me out of a restaurant. I'll have you reported. This is discrimination. I'll ruin your reputation. People were definitely staring now, some with their phones out, and I felt a strange calm settle over me. Patricia, I said, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear clearly. Marcella's has a 2-month waiting list and has been recognized by the Michelin Guide for 3 consecutive years. We don't need your endorsement. What we also don't need is you ever setting foot in this establishment again. You're banned, permanently. David and the staff were professional, polite but firm, positioning themselves to escort Patricia and Michael to the door. Patricia sputtered, threatened, said she'd tell everyone how I'd trapped her son, how I'd deceived them, how this was all some elaborate scheme. Michael just looked broken, reaching for me one more time before David gently redirected him toward the exit. You'll regret this! Patricia shrieked as they guided her through the dining room. You'll never find anyone else. You're nothing without my son. And then something unexpected happened. As Patricia and Michael disappeared through the front door, someone at a nearby table started clapping. Then another person joined in. Within seconds, half the dining room was applauding, and a woman at the table beside ours raised her wine glass to me with a knowing smile. I sat back down, alone at the table with 3 place settings and Patricia's expensive wine, and felt my hands start to shake, not from fear or regret, from the sheer relief of finally standing up for myself. It felt like I'd been holding my breath for 18 months and could suddenly breathe again. David appeared at my shoulder, his voice gentle. You okay, boss? I looked up at him and realized I was smiling. Yeah, I said, and meant it. I really am. The next 3 days were chaos, but the manageable kind. The kind where you know you made the right choice even though everyone else is losing their minds. Michael called 17 times the first day. I counted, leaving voicemails that started with tearful apologies and ended with accusations. I'd trapped him, apparently, led him on, deliberately deceived him and his mother. He'd loved me for who I was, he claimed, which was rich considering he'd never bothered to find out who that was. By day 2, the texts were coming in paragraphs. He'd been blindsided, humiliated. How could I do this to him in public? His mother was devastated. I owed them both an explanation and a chance to fix this. Patricia, meanwhile, had taken to social media like a woman possessed, posting vague but pointed status updates about gold diggers and people who deceive their way into relationships, and how she'd tried to warn her son about opportunists. It backfired spectacularly. 3 people who'd been at the restaurant that night posted their own accounts of what actually happened, and suddenly Patricia's narrative was competing with eyewitness testimony about her loudly calling someone too poor at a nice restaurant. The community rallied. Marcella's had regulars, loyal ones, and they flooded Patricia's comments with defenses of me and the restaurant. Someone even posted a link to a profile piece the local magazine had done on me 2 years ago, complete with photos and the story of how I'd built a business from nothing. Patricia deleted her social media by day 3. Allison showed up at my apartment with Thai food and wine, pulled me into a hug, and said, "I'm so fucking proud of you," before we'd even made it to the couch. We spent the evening reading the most unhinged texts from Michael, and she helped me draft a single, final response. "I wish you well, but we're done. Please don't contact me again." Then I blocked his number. I blocked Patricia's too, and Trevor's, and anyone else connected to that family. I went back to work, threw myself into menu planning for the fall season, and realized how much energy I'd been hemorrhaging trying to be acceptable to people who were determined to find me lacking. I felt lighter, not happy exactly, not yet, but unburdened. Like I'd been carrying a weight I hadn't fully acknowledged until I finally set it down. 3 months later, I'm sitting in my office at Marcella's, reviewing next quarter's financials, and I realize I haven't thought about Michael in almost a week. That feels like progress. The restaurant is thriving. We just got our 3rd Michelin star recommendation and had to hire 2 more servers to handle the demand. I've been on a few dates, nothing serious. Just coffee and conversation with people who ask questions and actually listen to the answers. I'm not rushing into anything. I've learned my lesson finally, after years of making the same mistake in different variations. Never shrink yourself to fit someone else's limited perception of who you should be. Never tolerate mistreatment in the name of keeping peace, because that's not peace. It's just slow erosion of your self-worth. Michael sent one final letter about a month ago, handwritten, saying he understood why I ended things and that he should have done better, should have been braver, should have seen me. It was a good apology, maybe even genuine, but it didn't change anything. Some relationships aren't meant to be saved. They're meant to teach you what you won't accept anymore. I didn't respond. But here's my favorite part, the detail that makes me smile every time I think about it. I found out through mutual acquaintances that Marcella's was Patricia's favorite restaurant. She'd been coming here for years, brought all her book club friends, celebrated every milestone, and now she can never come back. She chose my restaurant as the stage for her grand rejection, and in doing so, she rejected herself from the one place in the city she actually loved. The irony is so perfect, it almost feels like poetry. Patricia thought she was protecting her son from someone beneath him, someone who would drag him down and embarrass the family. Really, she just lost the person who was too good for both of them, the person who'd spent 18 months trying to earn approval that was never going to come. I don't regret walking away. I don't regret the public nature of it, or the scene, or any of it. For the first time in my life, I chose my own dignity over someone else's comfort, and it turns out that feels pretty damn good. So here's my question for you. Did I go too far or not far enough? Let me know what you think.